Good evening, everyone. My name is Sam Nasser, and this is the Cleveland C# VB.NET user group. A little bit about the group. We meet every month. The meetings are free of charge and open to the public, and we cover a variety of topics related to .NET. You can find meeting information posted at meetup.com at the link listed at the bottom of the slide. I always like to give a big thank you to our sponsors, PostSharp and DevExpress, for sponsoring the post-meeting prizes that will be given away using the eval forms. I would like to thank the .NET Foundation for sponsoring the meetup space, and NIS Technologies for sponsoring the virtual meeting space. Also like to give a big thank you to Manning.com for a 35% off offer on a specific selection of books, and you can access those at the link listed there at the bottom of the slide, and that will be made available in chat shortly after the meeting. In addition, you have to utilize the discount code MTPCLEC21, and that will also be pasted into the chat window afterwards. Some general information: please keep in mind that participation is encouraged, and I always say the only stupid question is the one not being asked. However, when not speaking, kindly ask you to mute your microphones just to avoid any background noise. And we always like to keep it casual but organized, meaning feel free to jump in at any point in time with questions or comments, but we want to give our speaker enough time to go through the slides and the demos. Lastly, the presentation is being recorded and will be posted on YouTube in just a few short days after the editing. So for tonight's feature presentation, it is Effective Application Logging for Maximum Success by Barret Blake. Barret is a Microsoft MVP and a solutions architect. He joins us from the Columbus area. He's also a board member of JavaScript and Friends Conference. And like all Columbus residents, he's a big Buckeyes fan, as well as a model railroader. And as you might have guessed from the background, he is also a very avid Star Wars fan. And so with that, let me turn it over to Barret, and I will make you presenter. All right, take it away, Barret.
All right. Let's see. Okay, so I think my screen should be showing now.
Yep.
All right. So what I'm going to be talking about this evening is just some strategies, for setting up an effective logging system for your applications. Kind of talking about why we need to do that, or why it's important, and some of the approaches and strategies that you might want to take to putting that into place. So just a little bit about myself. So like I said, my name is Barret Blake, and I won't go through all this since Sam already covered a lot of that. But just note, my Twitter link there, Barret Blake, or you can also get my blog there and hit me up on LinkedIn as well. Always happy to chat and answer questions and provide feedback for anything that anybody has. And like I said, at any time during the presentation, if you have questions, be sure to just jump right in and speak up and let me know. I'm happy to answer what I can. So without any further ado, let's just go ahead and dive right in here. So, and I will mention, this is the first time that I've kind of given this presentation, so probably be a little rough, but hopefully you learned something from it. So now, a lot of times, when we're starting a new application, we all kind of start off the same way. We start writing some code, we get into it. It doesn't really matter the language or the environment that we're working in. We start getting through things and start adding features and content, and eventually we get to the point where we're starting to try to debug things, try to figure some things out that are going not the way that we expect. So, obviously our first action or first step is to throw in some print commands or some console.writeline commands, depending on whatever environment that we're working in. Put in things like entering function X, or at this point this variable equals this amount, or we're leaving this particular function, or we caught this particular error, and when this error happened, here are the values of the variables. So things like that. We throw these little write lines all over the place. as we're trying to figure out some of the issues. And a lot of times we end up, we'll write them in, we'll put them in there for a purpose. We're trying to figure out an issue, and then when we're done, maybe we'll just comment them out. Sometimes we'll delete them, but most of the time we just kind of comment them out and just keep going from there. And eventually might, graduate from there to actually creating some kind of basic logging. We'll throw some things into a file. Maybe start with a single file at first, or if we want to get really sophisticated, we might add a feature where we're separating our files by each time execution instance, or maybe by date or something like that. And it works fine for a little while, but eventually we get to the point where we need more than that. For instance, we put our application out there, and maybe we start off with the logging the files, and then it gets out into production, starts running, and then things start going wrong. And if it's a server app, even if it's a server app and we're working in like a best practices environment, as developers, we really shouldn't have access to the production environments. That's something that we should be separated from. So if something goes wrong, we have to go through this whole big long spiel of getting either temporary access or getting somebody from the DevOps team or production support or whoever it is to go out, and we kind of have to walk them through getting those files for us and copy them out to somewhere where we can get access to them and look at them. And it's not an ideal approach. And even worse, if it's a application that's going out to like a client machine or something like that, or running on a local user machine, then you have to get a hold of the user. If they put in like a support ticket, you got to get a hold of the user. You have to walk them through, and a lot of times they're not technical people, and they'll have a hard time even getting through File Explorer. So we kind of have to walk them through where to find the file at, that we need the log file, how to copy it into their email or maybe Dropbox or something like that to get a copy to us so that we can take a look at it. So all those things take time, and if something goes wrong and our production environment is in serious trouble, every delay costs us time, costs us customers, costs us money. So it's not an ideal approach to take, but it's kind of the first step that a lot of us kind of start with. And excuse me. These log files that we're working with are generally they're very obtuse. They're just plain text files. They are wordy. They're very difficult to parse. You can see a sample here from a DirectX setup log file from my own machine. It can take forever to try to figure out which log file you need, to figure out where in that log file is the particular thing that you're looking for, if it even is in there, and then to try to understand all that text and try to come to a root cause of what the issue is. It takes a long time, and it can be very difficult for us to get to. And logging to files is reactive in nature. We don't know to even go look for an issue until somebody reports that there's an issue, or until we get some kind of notice that the server's gone down, something like that. And oftentimes by that time, it's really too late for us. The damage is already done. There's nothing we can do to prevent it. We just try to have to fix it and move on. So, maybe at this point we should kind of take a step back and talk about why we even want to do logging. What's the point of it? Why do we even need to add a logging strategy to our application development lifecycle? And the first reason is troubleshooting. And that's the most obvious one. An effective log, if we've put it in there, if we've designed it well, if we're maintaining it, then it will allow us to quickly and easily pinpoint the source of an issue that our application is experiencing. But if we can kind of step up that strategy a little bit, and we can kind of get it into being a monitoring tool, so something like monitoring the health of our application in real time, logging will not only help us pinpoint root causes, but it can also give us an overall view of the application at any given time, whether it's a website or a machine application, whatever it might be. It can tell us, what errors are the most common ones. If we are collecting that information and getting access to it on a regular basis, or even in real time, it can tell us where we need to put our debugging efforts into, and where we need to focus on fixing the issues that are the most common, the issues that our users are facing the most often. Another thing that it can do is it can help us to track activity. It tells us who is using our site, how often they're using it, what they're doing on it. It tells us what applications of our part or what parts of our application are actually working, and what part the users are actually using. We oftentimes go through all these processes of coming up with features for a new application, or for even an existing application. People have ideas, they put in feature requests, and we spend all these hours and hours and hours working on these things, and we get them out there deployed, and we don't know whether or not people are actually using them. Well, by having an effective logging strategy, we can tell what parts of the application people are actually using, and we can bring that information back and say, hey, we've got this list of 100 features that people have suggested to us, whether it's end users or the business side, or whatever it might be, product managers, whoever it might be. By taking that information and kind of comparing it to the parts of our application that people are actually using, that are actually working well for them, then it helps us to prioritize what our features should be, as far as the new features going forward. With monitoring, that there's kind of a rule that we can kind of keep in mind, is that there's a difference between what people say and what they do. As developers, we all know the struggle of trying to get an end user to effectively express what it is that they're actually trying to accomplish with an application. They say these things and they tell us these things, but a lot of times that's not accurate. A lot of times it's completely different between what they're telling you and what they're actually doing. Excuse me. By being able to log, what they're actually doing in the application, and kind of comparing that to what they're asking for, it helps us to parse that down into what's going to be the most effective, what's going to get us the most bang for our buck as we go forward. And by having an effective logging strategy, we can be a lot more proactive. Especially if we're evaluating logs in real time, if we're collecting that data in real time and processing it and taking a look at it, a lot of times we can spot trending issues before they get to the point that they're bringing our site down. We can see that a server is running out of CPU, or it's running out of disk space, or it's running out of this, or we can see if there's a sudden surge in 400 errors or 500 errors in our application at various points, and we can see that and respond to it before people start coming in and complaining. People love it when we fix the issues that they find, but what they love even more is not finding any issues at all. And so if we can spot those issues and squash them before they're actually causing problems to our end users, then the end users are much happier. And as we know, a quiet user is a happy user, because you don't ever hear from people when they're happy. You only hear from them when something's gone wrong. So that's a little bit about why we'd want to have an effective logging strategy. Excuse me, sorry. I was sick last week and I've still got a cough that's hanging on from that. So let's kind of delve into the various points that make an effective logging strategy. And let's start by talking about the kinds of things that we might want to log. So we might want to, one of the most obvious is like API calls. That's one of those things that tells us the parts of the application that people are using. And we might want to include things like the headers, the IP addresses, the parameters, the form data, the request bodies, response time, the responses that we're sending back, and the time that it took to process that API request from start to finish. Those are all important pieces that we might not all the time. Excuse me, not all the time. And we'll talk about what to log when later. But sorry, excuse me. But those are the kinds of things that we should be prepared to collect if we need to. Another thing is authentication and authorization and security auditing in general. How many successful logins? That's kind of, and especially the failures. That's the kind of thing that can help us to spot potential security threats and security issues. Being able to track, like I say, security auditing, being able to track who did what and when, so that you have that proof of activity going back. So somebody says, "Well, I didn't do that," and you can go back in the log and say, "Well, yeah, you did it here on this day at this time. Here's the API call. They logged in with your user ID, and this is what they did." And then other things like authorization failures. If people are trying to access things that they shouldn't have access to, that's another thing where it can you can look at that and say, okay, maybe I've got issues with the things that my application is displaying to the end user. Because if it's something that they shouldn't have access to, they shouldn't even be seeing it on their screen. So it helps you to evaluate your security strategy for your application by kind of tracking those authorization failures. Another thing that we'd want to track is function calls. Maybe it starts at an API call, but as it delves deeper and deeper through the call stack into the various functions, we'll want to keep track of where things are at which time, the parameters that are being passed in, the execution time for each of those function calls. That helps us to identify maybe areas where we need to focus on performance improvements. If we've got a particular function that is, maybe with certain parameters, it's running in 3 seconds. And then if somebody's passing on a different parameter, it takes 30 seconds to do. Well, it helps us to put some focus on where we need to improve our performance, maybe with processing improvements or indexes in our database or whatever it might be. And of course, errors and warnings. We always want to keep track of that stuff. We want to know when things are going wrong and the kinds of things that are causing it to go wrong. What are the values of the parameters when the error happens? What's the function trying to achieve? Is it a database issue? Is it an external API issue? Is it a resource issue? Whatever it might be. So keeping track of that kind of stuff. Opt in and opt out. Kind of getting back to user activity. Being able to prove that somebody, because people all the time will come back and say, "Well, I didn't sign up for this," or "I didn't sign up for that." Then you come back and say, "Well, okay, according to our records, you did this on this date, and by clicking this box or clicking this checkbox or whatever it might be." So you kind of have that backup for you there. Of course, data calls, interactions with file systems, with databases, with APIs, with our blob storage, whatever it might be. Keeping track of maybe what those calls out were, maybe what track the SQL query, track the parameters, track the filters that were used, track the result counts, the execution times, all that kind of stuff. System stats, things like CPU, disk performance, memory usage. There are a lot of ways of keeping track of this. Obviously, operating systems have a lot of that built in. Azure has a bunch of that stuff built in for the various app instances and the VMs. But those are all separate from the logging systems. And it can be really hard to correlate a spike in like CPU usage to what's going on in your logs. So if you're able to capture that information and include it in your logs as well, then that makes it a lot easier for you to correlate that data between system, things that are affecting the system and what's going on in your application at that particular time. So you can see if you can kind of pin down a culprit for what might be causing that spike in CPU usage or disk bottlenecks or whatever it might be. In system events in general, anything that might be going on in the system that might be an effect on your application. Sometimes it can be useful to capture that information as well. And a lot of times as you're working through your application, you'll have times where your error catching will take care of remediating an issue. Well, that's something else that you might want to keep track of. It's something that if it's something that's expected and happens frequently, then that's fine. You can kind of capture how often that kind of thing is happening. Take, for instance, maybe you're doing a file import and it automatically imports this file every day or every hour, whatever it might be. And maybe one file in 10 at random is going to be completely empty, and that throws an error to your import process. Well, if you've written your import process correctly, it'll automatically deal with that situation, and it won't cause the system to come down or cause an unnecessary exception. But being able to log that so that you can kind of keep track of, okay, how many of these files are empty. How often does that happen? It's another really useful piece of information that you might want to keep track of as you're going through your application and going through your logging. And of course, one other thing, no matter what it is that you're tracking in your information, always include timestamps. And it's most useful to always put those in UTC date format, or with the UTC time zone rather. That makes it a lot easier to convert between what people see on their screen at various times and the different systems, because maybe initially everybody's all working from one place, maybe all here in Ohio or a particular office or whatever it might be. But eventually, as your team grows, as your application grows, people are connecting from all over the place and interacting from all over the place. And it makes it a lot easier if you can have that one central system to be able to convert back and forth. And UTC is pretty much the standard for that. So always make sure that you're storing your date stamps in UTC form or in UTC time zone. So the next thing that we kind of want to be aware of is the various levels of logging. If we log everything all the time, then we clutter up our logs with a lot of useless data. And that can cost us quite literally. Yeah, I know data is cheap, CPU is cheap these days, but it's not completely free. So if we're unnecessarily logging absolutely everything all the time, that cost can add up quite quickly. So that's where the various log levels come in. There are some industry standards, and kind of you can see the typical industry standard there on the screen, the various levels. Where you've got trace, which gets absolutely everything. You've got debug, which is specifically generally like debugging messages. You've got info level, which is generally reserved for general information, program behavior, anything that kind of falls outside of a warning or an error. And then, of course, you got the warnings, the errors, and it goes all the way up to the most serious thing of a fatal or critical, depending on which system you're using. So you should, as you're thinking through your logging strategy, you should define policies of what kinds of information belong at which levels. Talk through the various things that you want to keep logging. Does the entering a function belong at the info level, or is that a strictly debug thing? Or figure out as you're going through and define what those policies are going to be, and document that standard so that every developer is working off that same standard, so that they're all approaching things in the same way. If we're using those standard levels or something close to it, generally most of the time, as the application's running in production, we'll want to keep that at maybe like the warn level or the error level, so it's only getting the most serious of issues. But excuse me. But we should also be scheduling regular time periods where we will turn on the collection of absolutely everything for a little while. And that helps us to capture a lot of things that might be going on outside the bounds of warnings and errors. Things like, user activity, things like, usage patterns, all that kind of stuff that helps us to, as I talked about earlier, figure out where people are actually using the application, where it's working, where it's not working. So even if you're not tracking all that information all the time, there's a lot of use in turning that on every so often, so that you can track it for maybe an hour or a couple hours, or maybe for a 24-hour period even, so that you can kind of get rise and fall of the usage patterns throughout the day, so you can see when people are using the application, what they're using, and so forth. And that should be part of your regular, production support schedule is turning that on for a little while, capturing that information, then turning it back off, or turning it back to like the warning or error level, whatever it might be. When it comes to user tracking, there's a few things that we need to keep in mind that I want to kind of bring to light. It could be that we're keeping that information tracked in one of the previously defined levels, or we might define another level, a logging level of some sort that's specifically for user information, or we might come up with an entirely different user tracking system um, that will track that information separately. But one of the things that we need to remember is we're doing that is we're thinking about what kinds of things that we want to track. We need to remember that there are a lot of laws out there that govern the kinds of user information that we can collect and keep, and what we can do with it, what we how we can store it, and all that kind of thing. For instance, the European Union has their I think it's GDPR law, which defines that users have to be able to get access to the information that you're keeping on them, and that you have to be able to delete that information when they request that you do. And there's also other countries, there's a lot of countries that specifically state laws where any information that you're keeping on a particular user who is a resident of their country has to be stored only on servers in their country. For instance, I think Germany is one of them that does that, if I recall correctly. So that all has to come in as part of your logging strategy, as you're talking about the kinds of things that you're going to track, specifically about users, and how you want to track and store that information. And that all needs to be part of that strategy as you're defining what your logging system is going to be and how it's going to work. So your logging system might need to account for those various data centers that you might need to use access for, or you need to make sure that part of the data tracking is flagging or identifying what that user information specifically is, so that you can easily find it and be able to provide it to the user or delete it upon the user request. So those things that you need to make sure you're tracking as part of that. And that user information includes login information. So if you are tracking what users are doing or what specific users are doing, then you need to be able to get access to that for those supporting those laws. We also need to make sure that anything that is like a personally identifiable information, we need to make sure that we're logging that. If we are logging any of that information, we need to make sure we're being very careful about how we handle that information. Things like birth dates, social security numbers, bank account information, credit card numbers, addresses, whatever it might be, home addresses. We need to make sure that if we find a need, or if we find a reason that we need to include that information in the logs, that it has to be stored in a appropriate manner. For instance, maybe it needs to be encrypted, maybe it needs to be stored in a separate table somewhere, or a separate data system somewhere that's outside the bounds of that. And we need to make sure that part of our logging strategy includes tools that will kind of parse that information and examine it on a regular basis, looking for that kind of sensitive information and making sure that we're storing it appropriately. And obviously, there are certain things that we should never store or log for any reason, things like passwords, encryption keys, any of that kind of stuff. If there's there's no reason that I've ever found where any of that information would ever need to be stored. So the part of that tooling needs to make sure that it's kind of looking for that information as well, so that you can scrub that if you need to. Let's see here. So all that kind of being said, kind of coming back into the logging levels, it lays out for us the importance of having a well-defined logging strategy around what information gets stored at which levels. And kind of one last thing kind of related to the logging levels is your system needs to be able to change those levels on the fly. If you look at a lot of the logging tools, or a lot of the basic logging tutorials that you go out there, a lot of times they'll store that logging level in like the app.config or the web.config file. And of course, excuse me, in most cases, we know that when you change information in that, it doesn't take effect until you restart the application or you reboot the system. So that's not the ideal way of storing and tracking that information. It's better to have something in place where you can change that logging level on the fly uh, without having to restart the application. You know, uh, we all know about the magical ability of applications to fix everything when you start it or when you stop it and start again. Have you turned it off, turned it on, back on again? And that magically solves most of the issues that people are running into. So, if in order to be able to capture certain environmental issues that might be causing the problems, we need to be able to change that logging status on the fly so that if we have it set at just the error level and things start going wrong and we want to turn it all the way up to trace, we need to be able to do that without having to restart the application. So that's important. I think an important part of having that in there as well is being able to make that change on the fly. Excuse me. All right. So the next thing I want to talk about is a way of tying all of the logging information around a particular process together. And one of the most common way is for people to implement like a process ID. So for instance, like a call comes into your API, maybe one of the first things you do is to generate a process ID, and then that process ID gets passed on down through the call stack as you're going to the various functions all the way from the API and the controller, down maybe into the next functions, and then into the business level functions, and then into the data layer, and so on and so forth. You can see an example kind of here. So you can see like in the first line here, it's creating this process ID as do good. And then when it calls into the getting the forecast data, it's passing that process ID down with it and going on down through there and storing that as part of all the logging information as it goes. So, having that process ID that's tied to all the records in your logging makes it a lot easier for you to be able to figure out which parts of the log are all tied into a single process. And, oh, did it stop sharing? Let me see here. Oops, let me try resharing here. Okay, is it showing the slides again?
Yep, you're good.
Okay. So not sure at what point that came off, but generates a process ID, passes it on down, and making sure that process ID is part of all of the log entries that go into your logging system makes it really easy to track that information going forward. A great example of this, I don't know if anybody's used Azure Functions and tied that to like an application insights process. It's great. It's all that's completely built in so that you can see everything that happens in that Azure function from start to end. It automatically applies a GUID, a process ID to it so that you can track all that together. But having that there makes it so much easier to parse and kind of step through and see what's going on there. So it can save you a lot of time in your debugging efforts later on if you need to. Let's see here. Come on, there we go. So next thing I kind of want to talk about is the structure. So while you can stream your logs into a file system, and as I've talked about before, if you're using files, log files, searching and parsing that are generally more difficult. Just offhand, I mean, you could put it into like a data lake or something like that, which would make it far easier to search, but that takes time and it can add to your expense if you want to go that route. So generally, most people kind of look at databases as the best way to store that log information. It doesn't matter whether that database is a SQL based or a NoSQL or like a document DB or Cosmos DB or Redis or whatever it might be. It doesn't really matter what it is, but I think in general, most people generally prefer a database of some sort because that makes it a bit easier to do that searching when you need to later on. A lot of the information, I kind of list a bunch of things here as suggestions of things that I would track as part of, even at a base level. By using, something like a document DB database, where well, I guess there's two approaches to it. So if you're using a SQL database, you have to have a very defined structure, obviously, because you have your table structure that's defined in there, and you can't really change that on the fly. So if you're using SQL, I'd recommend that you have at least a couple of tables or a couple of columns rather, for a couple for extraneous information. And most of the modern SQL systems, SQL Server, Oracle, Postgres, they'll all support table or columns that are like JSON based, so that you can put that unstructured data in there into those kinds of fields. For instance, like your list of parameters, or maybe some additional details that change in structure from place to place, depending on what function or what is that you're logging at that particular time. And they make it really easy to search that information as well going forward. So so you can use a SQL, or you can use a document DB, which is all JSON based and doesn't have to be as structured. But what I would definitely do if you're going to go with the document DB route is to make sure that you have a core structure that's defined and that is universal. So obviously, if one developer is naming something starting timestamp with an underscore in between the two, and another developer's camel cased it, and another developer just says timestamp start instead of starting timestamp, those are the kinds of things that you won't be able to search it as well going forward. So you need to make sure that if you're using a more unstructured database, that you have that defined structure as the core, and then they can add on to that whatever they might need to for that particular logging event. Let's see here. And then the kind of last thing I would talk about with database structures is to make sure that whatever system or whatever data source that you're using, make sure that you have set it up to support Unicode characters and not just, like the base ASCII characters. I can't tell you how many times over the years I've run into an issue where where it was a data issue where Unicode characters were trying to be shoved into a system that only supported ASCII, and just every time it seems like it takes forever to figure out that that's what the real cause is. So if you make sure that that's set up from the outset to support that, then you don't have quite as many issues around that. So then the next question is, how much should I log? You should always log the unexpected, but how much is too much? Where do I stop with the logging? And you'll find that when you're first getting started, you're going to ask yourself the question, am I logging too much? Yeah, you probably are, especially early on. But it's better to have too much logging information and not need it later on, than to have too little information and find that you don't have the information that you need to solve your problem. So you should always err on the side of caution. Like I said, while disk space is not cheap, it is pretty cheap. Or sorry, while it's not free, it is pretty cheap. So you can always circle back later and tone it down a little bit if you feel like you're really overdoing it. But what about situations kind of like what I mentioned before? If my code is appropriately handling an exception, I mentioned the example, if maybe there's a log or a file that is empty one time in 10, if that's something that is expected and planned for, do I need to log that? Well, that's kind of up to you. I certainly wouldn't log that as an error if it's something that was expected, but maybe that's something you might define as an info level event, things of that nature. So that you can capture it sometimes when you need to if you turn the logging levels up to that level, but you aren't always capturing it when you don't need to. So short version, always err on the side of caution, especially to start with, and then you can kind of parse it down from there as you figure out what's too much, what do I need, what don't I need. Another thing is to avoid duplication. So, if you're logging something at a particular level, you don't need to log that in a function lower down. Maybe it's parameter information, maybe it's certain things that are going on in the process. Excuse me. So, when you're creating a new log entry in a particular function, be aware of what functions at the higher level in the call stack are logging so that you don't duplicate that information. So again, that's going to save you time as you're trying to parse down through the information and figure out what's going wrong. But try to avoid that duplication as much as possible. Another thing that's important is to have a maintenance strategy in place. So you need to have policies defining, how long is that data going to live, and what's the long-term strategy for backups and for cleaning up the data. You're probably going to want to have different policies based on the level of information. Maybe the full info level information I want to keep for 12 months, error information I want to keep for 6 months, or whatever it might be. So it's very common to have different policies or different retention policies based on the logging level for that information. Another thing is you need to be aware of any laws around data retention, especially for things like auditing information or user tracking information. A lot of times there are laws that specify that you need to keep that kind of information for X number of years or whatever it might be. So, as you're developing this data maintenance strategy, you need to make sure that you're including your legal team and any security experts, so that you can determine, what does the law require that I have to keep, and then on top of that, what do we want to do for our own personal retention policies. Another strategy that you'll probably want to have in place is having a hot storage area versus a cold storage area. So maybe you want to keep excuse me, keep the information on a server that will be easily accessible and you can do your regular reporting off of. Maybe you want to keep the information there for 12 months and then move it into a cold storage area where it's archived, so you still have it and you can still access it, but you don't need to have it in the live system cluttering it up all the time. Especially things like the auditing information, like the information that you're required to keep legally, whatever it might be, that kind of stuff. You don't have to keep it there forever. So as long as you have a way of being able to access that information when it's needed, it doesn't need to be on your live system the whole time. So, figure out how much that's, how long you're going to keep it, and then come up with processes to either, purge the information when it's not needed, or move it from the hot storage to the cold storage, whatever it might be, based on what those policies are, and make sure that you're reviewing those policies on a regular basis. Set up a time, maybe annually, to sit down again with the legal team, with the experts, and say, okay, have the laws changed? Do we need to change what our strategy is, as far as how we're keeping this information, where we're keeping it, how long we're keeping it, that kind of stuff. Also, make sure that whatever your retention strategy is, whatever your live strategy system is, you need to make sure that you're keeping backups on a regular basis and that those backups are being tested. We've probably all heard, or maybe even experienced ourselves, horror stories about backups that aren't tested and that aren't, when things go down and they go to restore the backup, they find that the backups were being created, but they were corrupted or whatever it might be. One really fun story from my own experience is a company that I worked at previously was keeping all of their clients' keeping all the clients' task information on a Jira system that they were hosting in-house on their own server. We had a whole bunch of different clients, and we would keep track of all the work that we were doing and all the work that we had done on this Jira boards. It was on this server, and we came in one morning to find that the server's hard disk had died. And while they were making regular backups of this system, they were storing those backups on the same hard drive as the server itself. And so when the hard drive died, all the backups were gone, which was, a genius strategy. It was years of client data that was suddenly gone, and uh, you know, we were never able to completely restore it. At least they still hadn't by the time that I'd left, so they had to start over from scratch, and that had cost us quite a bit of goodwill with clients that we'd had. So remember, your backup strategy is just as important as your retention strategy and all the other policies that you put in place. So it's one of those that you need to have it. You need to make sure it's working. You need to make sure it's good, and you just hope that you never actually need to use it. So, excuse me. All right. So regardless of what your strategies are, there are a bunch of logging frameworks out there. We all live in a .NET world, most of us, I would assume, and there are a bunch of .NET frameworks that are out there. And with .NET Core, they've even added that as part of the .NET system itself now, because they've included that with .NET Core now, which makes it really easy. And it's actually, if you just start from scratch with a new app and do the default templates, it's already there in most of those templates. It already exists and it's already implemented. And you still have to tie it to a data store in the back end, but somehow. But it's become one of those things that's a default necessity. And even if you don't use what's built into .NET Core, there are a bunch of other frameworks out there, and Log4Net, that have been around forever. So whatever framework you decide on doesn't really matter, because they all work generally the same way. They have things that they tie into the processes, and you make calls out to it, and they send that information off to whatever logging store that that you're going to be using, whether it's a database or a file system or a third-party application, whatever it might be. And we'll talk about those in just a minute. But probably the most important thing about the framework is you need to make sure that whatever approach that you decide on, your logging process should never bog down your system. All logging calls should always be fire and forget. They should never be synchronous or inline. You never want your logging system to be the reason that your application comes down, especially in a case where things happen. It's going to lose connection to the logging store, whether it's database or API or whatever it's calling. If that backend dies for some reason, or loses the connection to that for some reason, then if your logging system's not working in a kind of an asynchronous manner, then it's going to bring down your application because it can't make those calls out to store the information. So make sure that whatever logging process you're using, make sure it's independent, so to speak, of the core thread. So make sure it's working in its own thread, how it's working. Excuse me. Let's see here. I don't think these days that that which framework you use really matters all that much. I think they're all pretty reliable, and they're all fairly, like I say, similar as far as features go, and the way that they all work. So it's not, I think, as big a consideration as it used to be. It used to be that people were dead set on using nlog or using log4net or using lmog or whatever it might be. But I think these days they've all become pretty, there's a lot of parity between them, so that it's not really, like I say, as big a concern as it used to be. And if you feel like it, you could probably write your own logging framework, but I wouldn't recommend it. Maybe someday, if you're truly bored, you might delve into that. So excuse me. So there are also a number of third-party platforms out there. So maybe as an alternative to, sending your logging information to a file or a database locally, there are a lot of third-party platforms out there where you can send your logs out to their system and it's stored externally. Some of them, most of them have their own plugins that either work in tandem with the frameworks that are in there or replace those frameworks. Just depends on which one you're using, how it approaches. Excuse me, y'all. Sorry about that. But they all have a number of different approaches. So, for instance, some of them are they have their own system where you send, like I say, you send your information, your login information off to their system. Some of them are more front ends for your own system. So you're still storing your information locally on yours, but they just provide you the tools to kind of delve into those logs and monitor those logs in real time. But regardless of how they work, they are a great way of getting up and running quickly with the kind of monitoring and real-time analysis and reporting and dashboards and all that kind of stuff that can help you, like I say, get up and running a lot quicker than creating your own logging platform. So there's that advantage there, but obviously as part of that there is there are cons to that as well, because there's an ongoing cost for those third-party applications, and another thing is you're dependent on an external vendor. What happens if their system goes down, and then you need to make sure that your logging has a good fallback system. What happens if they go out of business entirely? What happens to all of your information? For instance, if you were sending the logs off to their system, and it's rare, it doesn't happen a lot, but it does happen. Companies go out of business, and if you've become dependent on them and you're relying on them, then there's a danger of that. There's also the risk, with third-party applications, they might not be fully compatible with what you want to store or how you want to store it. So maybe they don't. maybe they have a set of logging structure that you have to follow their structure, as opposed to creating your own logging structure. So there are trade-offs either way. So if you roll your own, you've got to put a lot more effort in up front. There's a lot higher initial cost. It takes you a lot longer time to implement it. And you have to have that expertise in the house. You can't rely on somebody else outside, for their expertise. And especially initially, is that they, and then initially, if you're rolling your own, you have a lot fewer features. It takes you time to build those reports, to build those, dashboards and so on and so forth. Whereas the third-party tools have a lot of that stuff out of the box, kind of thing. So, I say they advertise easy to use, but in reality, it could be complex. Yeah, that is true. The one other advantage too is that a lot of these third-party tools support different languages. So, if, for instance, you have an application that's using a JavaScript SPA app on the front end and a .NET API on the back end, for you've got to write two different frameworks. A lot of times these third-party companies will have frameworks that support both of those out of the box. So like I say, there's a lot of trade-offs both directions, and it's just a matter of what you decide is going to be a more effective strategy for you as a company and as part of your application. But regardless of whether you're using a third-party application or you're rolling your own logging system, there's one element that's absolutely critical, and that's that the logging system should be separate from the application that it's monitoring. So it doesn't do you any good to have a log monitoring system if it's integrated into the application that it's monitoring. If your application goes down, so does your log monitoring tool. So you need to make sure that that the tool is separate from the application that it's actually keeping track of. Let's see here. Come on, there we go. So, I mentioned briefly reporting. Whether you're rolling your own or using third-party tools, you're going to need reports. You're going to need dashboards. You're going to want lots and lots of reports and dashboards covering all kinds of different things. And as much as possible, should be updating and monitoring your logging in real time, or at least as real time as you can get. For the very reason that I mentioned earlier, that you need to see those trends as they're occurring if you want to be able to prevent things from getting worse. So if you can spot a sudden spike in usage, if you can spot a sudden surge in error messages and things like that, you can start looking into that and addressing that before somebody starts complaining about it. So the faster that you can respond to it, the more, or the happier that your end users are going to be. So that's one area where obviously the third-party tools excels, because they have all kinds of dashboards and reports already in there, that are ready to go out of the box with a minimum of setup. Whereas if you're rolling your own, you've got to create each one at a time, figure out what those are going to be, and so on and so forth. So, and what's even more ideal is if you can have an alerting system kind of built into these dashboards, so that it can kind of spot those trends, spot where things are starting to go wrong, or things have suddenly changed, and alert you to those changes, so that you can kind of look into it long before it becomes an issue. So the reporting strategy is, excuse me, is critical as well. Another thing that your tool should do, obviously dashboards are great, reports are great, but they only get you so far. At some point, you need to start tracking an issue. You need to start digging down into the log data to figure out the root cause of a particular issue. Many of these tools have various means of doing these queries. For instance, you can see on the screen there is an example from Application Insights that it's the tool that Azure has built into it. It uses a language called KQL, which is very similar to SQL. I don't remember what the K stands for, but it's something query language. But if you're somebody who's deeply ingrained into the Azure world, if that's where your applications live, and you're using app services, and you're using function apps and logic apps and whatever it might be, Azure apps, Azure SQL DB or whatever it might be, you might seriously want to consider investing in App Insights, at least getting knowledge of it, because there's a lot that it lets you do, and it makes it really easy to kind of track down those issues and do some searching. But one of the things that I would definitely recommend that you don't do is to, if you need to start querying that information, and you're storing that information in a SQL database or document database, don't have your solution be somebody opens up SQL Server Management Studio and starts doing queries against your logging data. Again, circling back to the horror stories, we all know somebody or some situation, or maybe we've done it ourselves, where you typed in the wrong command, didn't realize you were in production as opposed to dev, and you wipe out a table, or you delete a bunch of stuff that you hadn't expected to delete because you had a typo in your where clause or whatever it might be. So if you are storing that information in a SQL database, make sure you either have very strict security, on it, only giving the developers read-only access or whatever it might be, or you can create some kind of other interface that is read-only, that gives access to do these kinds of queries, whatever it might be. So it's very important that you protect that information that's in there and make it not make it too difficult to access, but make it something that takes special care to get access to and to make those queries against, so that you can protect that data. Because, like I say, it's something that's critical, and you don't want what somebody's doing to destroy that, or to, maybe if somebody accidentally does an update that locks a table for an hour, then suddenly, your system's no longer to add logging entries to the table, and so on and so forth. It's just a whole string of things that can go wrong that way. Sorry, does somebody have a question? Couldn't hear. No. Okay. And then kind of one of the last things I want to cover is, uh, should I have one central logging system or a different system for each application? And that's a good question. Yes, no, maybe, I don't know. It's really up to you. There are a lot of disadvantages and advantages to each. Obviously a central logging system can be great for high-level monitoring, for keeping track of what's going on across the entire infrastructure. But what happens when your one central logging system to rule them all goes down? Um, at best, you don't know what's happening in any of your systems. And at worst, if you design things badly, it can bring down your entire company because, those applications that are trying to send these log messages to this one central system, they're all having issues and it can bring down all the applications. So generally what I recommend is kind of a tiered approach. So each application has its own independent log monitoring system. And then you can have a central system that collects the logs from those various log monitoring tools into a central repository that can be used for like company-wide monitoring and reporting, kind of like a data warehouse works. Or even better, you can use an actual data warehouse, for that central system. And then you can throw some Power BI reports and some dashboards on top of it and, do something of that nature. Obviously at that central level, they're not going to need to do the log parsing. They're not going to need to do anything other than like generalized long-term reports. So I think a tiered system is generally the best approach to take to it. So kind of when it comes on down to this, again, why should I care? So effectively planning out logging takes time, it takes effort. It adds to your development effort, sure. It's something that, a lot of operating systems and web server platforms, IIS or whatever it might be that you're using, they all have built-in logging, and sure, that's great, gets you to a certain point, but that out of the box logging is very minimal at best. It doesn't know your application, it doesn't know the nuances of it, and it doesn't really provide the kind of detail that you need to truly track down an issue if something happens. So if you take the time to plan out an effective logging strategy and to implement it, define those policies, make sure all of your developers are on the same page, then you can save yourself hours and hours of troubleshooting later on when problems do arise. And problems will arise. We've all been there. We all have spent countless hours in production support in one way or another. Your app is going to go down. It's going to crash. It's going to have problems. And the quicker that you can fix those problems and get your application back up and running, the happier everybody's going to be. The longer that your system is down, the more customers that you're going to lose. And when you lose customers, then your business loses money. And when the business loses money, they start cutting costs. And again, as we all know, when it's time to start cutting costs, the first people to go out the door are the IT staff. Well, actually, probably the recruiters first and then the IT staff, but still. So, whatever strategy you're taking, whether you're going to roll your own, whether you're going to use a third-party tool, however you want to approach it, you need to make sure that you have that logging strategy in place, that you're logging those applications, that you're keeping track of the information that's going to help you to solve those issues, and that that you're making use of it and have implemented it. So again, that's what I've got. I thank you for your time. Does anybody have any questions or anything that they'd like to ask about or discuss?
I have a question if no one else has a question for you.
Sure.
What do you think of utilizing like a queue to store all the logging messages that need to be logged to a system? So that way, if you have various applications, whether it be mobile or web API rather, or desktop applications, all trying to log things to this logging system, basically by using a queuing or messaging type of queue, that it would handle all these multiple requests. Have you done that before?
Yeah, and I actually have made use of that for a system that I set up for one of my previous companies. We were setting up a system that was taking files and information out of Dynamics and moving it into various external systems through Azure Data Factory. And we're using Azure Functions and Logic Apps and other things to kind of facilitate all that movement back and forth. And excuse me. And the way that we were doing it, because we wanted all the logging surrounding all that stuff to go into one central place, so we were actually using a service bus in Azure, and everything was sending the messages to that service bus, and then the service bus would trigger an Azure function that would log it out to a SQL table. So we were using that approach, and I do recommend something like that. You don't. I find it's more effective to have something where those logging messages are getting stored somewhere, whether it be a service bus or a queue or in-memory storage, for instance, using Redis or something like that, and then have a separate process that's kind of operating outside of what's generating the log messages, grabbing that information, grabbing those records, and then moving them to the database from there. And that's just that separation of concerns, because you don't want your logging system to bring down the application. Whereas, if you got something set up where it's trying to write directly from your application to maybe your SQL server, and it loses that connection or something happens, and that can bog down your system, especially if you've designed it poorly and you're doing things like synchronous messaging or something like that. So it's generally a lot better to have kind of that intermediate step where it's something quick like in memory or a message bus or something like that to store that information before it gets picked up and actually logged. So.
And then another question for you. Let's say that in your application you throw an exception, and obviously you're going to be logging that exception. What happens if the logging mechanism is down and you can't access it? How would you handle that at that point?
So generally what I try to do is to have a fallback system. So in most cases you can implement a fallback fairly easily, where if it can't reach its primary destination, it'll just throw it into a file on the local system, something like that. And then, of course, you need to, for situations when that happens, you need to have some other process in there to kind of recognize that that's going on and to send some kind of alert. Say, hey, your connection to the database or to the message bus or whatever it is down. You need to go look at this kind of thing. So yeah, it's always good to have a fallback if you can implement something like that.
Right. Very logical approach. Okay. Well, thanks, Barret. Appreciate it. Want to see if anyone else has any questions for Barret or comments? And
this was a
let me
great
transition.
session. You've had a lot of good information. Thank you.
You're welcome. I apologize again for the coughing.
Don't feel bad. I've been fighting a cough for the last 3 weeks as well, and I'm just on the tail end of it now. So completely understandable. Anyone else have any questions for Barret? Or comments for that matter? All right. Before we wrap it up, I have a couple announcements that I'd like to go through. And let me go ahead and share my screen if I may. All right, so thanks again to Barret for a great presentation. Very insightful and learned a lot. And also, for those that joined us a little bit later, we have a special offer from Manning.com, 35% off a selection of books available at the URL listed at the bottom of the slide. And if you look in the chat window, you'll see that I pasted that URL as well as the discount code. In addition, I posted a few other links, which we'll discuss in just a little bit. One of the things I always like to cover are upcoming tech events. So on July 11th is the DBA Fundamentals Group, and they're going to be talking about Azure Arc and enabling Azure Arc data. On July 12th is going to be the Azure Cleveland User Group, and we're going to be talking about code reviews on that meeting. On July 19th is the Akron Women in Tech. That is a virtual meeting, and I will be talking about an introduction to artificial intelligence. So if you're available online, you're more than welcome to join us. And on July 20th is the Great Lakes user group for .NET, also known as glug.net, and they meet on the third Thursday of the month. And then lastly, the fourth Thursday of July is this group. This is going to be our July meeting on July 27th. So feel free to join us at that time. We're going to be discussing Power Apps. And then lastly, for conferences, on July 15th is the SQL Saturday in Columbus. That is a free all-day event, and allow me to share my URL with that. So that is posted on on my blog with a link. What SQL Saturday is basically an all-day event, free day event rather, of different training sessions on the Microsoft Data Platform. And it's going to be held in person in Columbus, Ohio. It's free. If you'd like to purchase a lunch ticket, I think they're $15. And in addition to that, they also have some pre-cons that are available. These are pre-con, aka pre-conference. Those are a couple all-day sessions that will be taking place on the Friday before, so on Friday, July 14th. And there's going to be a couple interesting topics. Understanding and optimizing SQL Server performance. And the second event is Introduction to Python for Data Science and Data Engineering. And these run from 8 to 4:30. So the pre-cons are $125 each. The SQL Saturday event on Saturday is free of charge. And I strongly encourage you all to attend. It's a great event. Just to give you an idea of what's going to be available. So they have a variety of topics, all relating to SQL Server and the Microsoft Data Platform, whether it's in Azure or SQL Server, and as well as non-SQL Server related topics as well. So here we have modernizing your BI architecture with Data Lakehouse, introduction to automated deployments with Azure DevOps, SQL Server security, DBA tools, etc., etc. So it's a great event, highly recommend it, free of charge on Saturday, July 15th.
Is this a live-only event, or can you attend it virtually?
It's live only.
Okay.
The other thing we always like to discuss are job openings. So you can find a variety of job openings at techsystems.com/IT-jobs. But always like to ask who's hiring and who's looking for work. If you would please make yourself known in the chat window or speak up verbally, I would be happy to help. Anyone looking for work or know of an open position? Seems like everyone is gainfully employed at this time, which is good.
So I'm not sure about the Cleveland area, but I know in the Columbus area we're always looking for people for .NET skills at CGI. So.
Okay, good to know. Do you have a link available?
I can give you the company website, cgi.com. I don't know
Sure.
what the local job posting is off the top of my head.
Yeah, if you would please post that into chat. As well as, speaking of chat, you'll notice that there's a link to my blog. And that's where I posted the tech events that we just went through. And so you can always reach out there, click the links to get access to those events. Lastly, my contact information. My email is snasser@nistechnologies.com if I can help you in any way. My Twitter handle, @SamNasser. My blog, as I mentioned earlier. And if we're not connected on LinkedIn, I invite you to do so. And so with that, thanks again to Barret for a great presentation, and thank you all for attending, and look forward to seeing you all next month. Good night, everyone.